In the heart of the antebellum South, on a struggling plantation, a father made a calculation. His name was Clement Delaney. And his plan to save his family from ruin would not involve cotton, or trade, or honest work. It would involve a legal loophole, and his own 3 daughters. He discovered a monstrous truth: the children of his 3 beautiful daughters could be legally sold as property, if the paperwork was forged just right. And so, the Delaney home wasn't just a house, it became a factory. A breeding farm. Where his own children were the livestock. He locked them away. He conditioned them. He forced them into a systematic nightmare, all to produce a single, terrible product: his own grandchildren. This is not just a story about the evil of slavery. This is a story about how a respectable man, a father, can transform into the most intimate kind of monster. It's about the systematic dehumanization of his own flesh and blood, recorded in his ledger books with cold, calculated precision. But every reign of terror breeds a desperate resistance. And when his youngest daughter, Frida, could take no more, her mother, Joanna, was finally pushed to an unthinkable act. What would you do when the law offers no protection, and the monster is the man sitting at the head of your table? The answer lies in the shadows of Delaney Plantation, and it's a story you will not forget. Subscribe to The Truth Fear. The full, disturbing investigation starts now. On the eve of the American Civil War, in the year 1860, the state of Louisiana simmered with tensions that stretched far beyond mere politics. Down in the Mississippi Delta, where a hot, heavy steam carried the sweet aroma of cotton mixed with the acrid smell of human sweat, small plantations fought to survive the economic instability plaguing the South. Just a few miles from New Orleans, a city where slave auctions filled the public squares daily, the Delaney Plantation stretched across a modest 200 acres of fertile land. This was not one of the grand estates that dominated the region. Instead, it was home to a family desperately clinging to their fragile place in Southern society. Clement Delaney was no cotton baron. A man of limited means, he was the owner of only 15 slaves and a 2-story wooden house already showing signs of deterioration. But the events within those walls, between 1860 and 1863, would reveal a face of slavery few dared to imagine. This stands as one of the most disturbing stories I have ever encountered about the hidden horrors of the antebellum South. A story demonstrating how desperation can transform a family man into something far worse than any monster. Before we continue, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And if this is your first time with us here at The Truth Fear, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that will keep you awake long into the night. Better days were a memory at the Delaney Plantation. Clement Delaney, at 45, was a man of medium stature, his brown hair already graying, his hands calloused from work. Unlike the great landowners who rarely dirtied their hands, Clement worked side by side with his slaves in the cotton fields, a necessity he tried to disguise as his own choice. His wife, Joanna, at 38, had aged prematurely. Her blonde hair, once brilliant, now hung lifeless around a face deeply marked by constant worry. She had given birth to 4 children, but only 3 had survived: Arlene, 19, Carolyn, 17, and Frida, the youngest at just 15. By the standards of the time, the 3 Delaney daughters were considered beautiful. Arlene possessed her mother's golden hair and penetrating blue eyes. Caroline had inherited more delicate features, with brown hair and a fragile constitution. The youngest, Frida, combined her sister's beauty with a vivacity not yet completely suffocated by the grim realities of adult life. The plantation operated with 15 slaves, 8 men and 7 women. Among them was Tobias, a strong man of about 30 who served as an informal overseer, and Leah, 25-year-old woman who worked in the big house. Most had been born on the property, creating a complex family dynamic that Clement would soon learn to exploit in the most terrible way. Their financial troubles had begun back in 1858, when a plague devastated much of the cotton crop. The harvest yielded less than half of what was expected, forcing Clement to take out loans with exorbitant interest from merchants in New Orleans. To make a dire situation worse, Clement developed a gambling addiction that consumed any extra money. The nights when Clement disappeared to the card tables became more and more frequent. He would return in the early morning hours, often with less money than he had taken, his face marked by frustration and drink. During these absences, Joanna would often find him muttering alone in his office, calculating and recalculating numbers on pieces of paper that he would quickly hide when she approached. By 1859, the situation had become completely unsustainable. Creditors began appearing at the plantation, well-dressed men from New Orleans who spoke in cold, legal terms about debt execution and property confiscation. Clement was forced to sell 3 of his most valuable slaves, a decision that humiliated him deeply before the local community. While the sale brought temporary relief, it also revealed something deeply disturbing in Clement's behavior. During the negotiations, he demonstrated a calculating coldness that shocked even the experienced buyers. He examined the teeth, muscles, and scars of his slaves as if they were cattle, openly discussing their reproductive capabilities and market value. Dr. Reuben McCormick, the local physician who occasionally visited the plantation, noticed the changes in Clement's behavior during this period. The man who had once been reserved but cordial became increasingly isolated and obsessive. McCormick observed Clement beginning to ask strange questions about fertility, pregnancy, and the laws governing the legal status of slave children. The tone of Clement's conversations with other slave owners also shifted. He began showing an excessive interest in the more sordid aspects of human trafficking, asking pointed questions about breeding farms and methods to maximize the productivity of female slaves. These comments caused discomfort even among men accustomed to the inherent brutality of slavery. Sheriff Peter Mullins, who had known Clement for years, noticed the man had begun avoiding eye contact during his occasional visits to the plantation. Mullins initially attributed this to financial embarrassment. But there was something deeper in Clement's behavioral change, a furtive quality that suggested thoughts which should never be spoken aloud. During the winter of 1859, Clement spent long hours locked in his office, studying legal documents and slave codes. Joanna would occasionally find him hunched over borrowed law books, making notes on pieces of paper that he quickly hid when she entered the room. He had acquired several volumes on property law and inheritance rights, material that seemed entirely inappropriate for a simple cotton farmer. A subtle change began to permeate the atmosphere of the big house. The daughters noticed their father was observing them differently, with an evaluative gaze that made them deeply uncomfortable. Arlene commented to her mother that she felt as if she were being examined, though she couldn't quite explain what she meant. Leah also noticed the changes in Clement's behavior. He began asking her questions about her health, age, and reproductive history that felt inappropriate, even for a slave owner. She noticed he paid special attention to the younger slave women, watching them work with an intensity that made her uneasy. Family meals became tense events, with Clement often lost in thought, responding to attempts at conversation with grunts or vague comments. Joanna tried desperately to maintain normality but felt a growing anxiety she couldn't explain. She began to see that Clement was taking notes during meals, observing his daughter's eating habits and general health with an attention that seemed more clinical than paternal. In January of 1860, Clement made a mysterious trip to New Orleans that lasted 3 days. When he returned, he brought with him a leather briefcase containing documents he carefully stored in his office. He had also established contact with a man known only as Bora, whom Clement vaguely described as someone who could help with complex legal matters. The spring of 1860 brought a promising harvest, but it also marked the beginning of more dramatic changes in Clement's behavior. He began reorganizing the slave quarters, separating men and women more rigidly, and implementing new regulations that seemed to have no clear purpose. The Delaney daughters noticed their father had begun restricting their social activities, canceling visits to neighboring families and actively discouraging visitors. He claimed it was due to concerns about security and the growing political tensions, but his explanations felt forced and inadequate. Dr. McCormick made his last social visit to the plantation in April of 1860. He would later describe the atmosphere as strangely oppressive, noting the family seemed to be under a kind of stress that went far beyond their known financial difficulties. During this visit, McCormick observed Clement making disturbing comments about the efficiency of certain plantations in maximizing their human resources. The doctor was particularly unsettled when Clement asked him about methods for determining the fertility of young women and the risks associated with frequent pregnancies. Sheriff Mullins made his last official visit to the plantation in May of 1860, investigating reports of runaway slaves in the region. He noticed the slaves at Delaney Plantation seemed more submissive and fearful than normal, avoiding eye contact and responding to questions with nervous monosyllables. Mullins also observed that Clement had installed new bolts and locks on several doors of the big house, a measure he justified as a precaution against possible slave revolts. However, the location of some locks suggested they were designed to keep people in, not out. The summer of 1860 marked the point of no return for Clement Delaney. Financial pressures, combined with his growing obsession with a desperate solution, led him to a decision that would transform his family into victims of his own greed and depravity. By June of 1860, Clement Delaney had become a man consumed by an idea growing in his mind like a cancer. During his obsessive research into the laws of slavery, he had discovered a legal doctrine dating back to the earliest days of American colonization, partus sequitur ventrum. This law established that a child's condition followed that of the mother. If the mother was a slave, the child would be born a slave, regardless of the father's status. The perverse genius of Clement's plan lay in his understanding of a legal loophole. The children of his own daughters, being born to free mothers, would technically be free by law. But with falsified documentation, these babies could be registered as children of slaves, making them sellable property. It was a monstrous distortion of the law that would transform his own grandchildren into merchandise. During his trips to New Orleans, Clement had established contact with Bogard, a forger who operated in the shadowy alleys of the French Quarter. This man, whose real name was never revealed, specialized in creating birth certificates, baptismal certificates, and property records that could withstand casual scrutiny from the authorities. Bogard operated from a small office above a tavern, where he also offered forgery services for manumission papers and travel documents for runaway slaves, a dangerous but extremely lucrative business. For $50 per document, a substantial sum at the time, he could obtain birth certificates attributing the maternity of any child born on the plantation to one of Clement's slaves, ensuring these babies could be legally sold. Clement began implementing his plan with the meticulousness of a businessman planning a major expansion. He completely reorganized the slave quarters, creating what he called special rooms, small, isolated cabins where reproduction would occur under his direct supervision. The first phase involved the careful selection of male slaves who would be used as breeders. Clement chose Tobias and two other young, strong men, basing his decision on criteria that included physical health, a docile temperament, and, disturbingly, physical characteristics he considered commercially desirable in their future offspring. The female slaves were also subjected to a degrading evaluation. Clement personally examined Leah and the other women, checking their reproductive health with a clinical coldness that left them traumatized. He made detailed notes about their menstrual cycles, previous pregnancy history, and estimated ability to produce quality offspring. But the most shocking part of Clement's plan involved his own daughters. Arlene, Carolyn, and Frida would be forced to participate in the breeding scheme, generating children who would be immediately separated from them and registered as slave children. Clement rationalized this monstrous decision as a necessary sacrifice to save the plantation and maintain the family's status. To implement this phase, Clement began making subtle changes to the domestic routine. He installed special locks on his daughters' rooms, claiming security concerns. In reality, these locks were designed to prevent them from escaping when the time came to fulfill their role. Clement also began administering to his daughters a mixture of herbs he obtained from a local healer named Marie, claiming it was to strengthen their feminine health. In fact, this mixture contained substances intended to regulate their menstrual cycles and increase their chances of conception. The healer, unaware of the true purpose, believed Clement was genuinely concerned about his daughter's health. Psychological manipulation was as important as the physical preparations. Clement began isolating his daughters from the outside world, cancelling social visits and prohibiting correspondence with friends. He gradually conditioned them to accept increasing restrictions on their freedoms, psychologically preparing them for the total submission his plan would require. Joanna began noticing disturbing changes in her husband's behavior toward their daughters. He watched them with a disturbing intensity, making comments about their maturity and development that left her deeply uncomfortable. When she tried to question these observations, Clement dismissed her with irritation, claiming she was being hysterical and imagining things. In July of 1860, Clement made another trip to New Orleans, this time returning with basic medical supplies and manuals on childbirth and infant care. He claimed he was preparing for the possibility of not being able to call Dr. McCormick during emergencies, but the quantity and specificity of the materials suggested preparation for multiple births. Clement also established contact with slave traders in New Orleans, inquiring about current prices for babies and small children. He discovered that healthy babies could be sold for $200 to $300 each, depending on their appearance and perceived health. Children of more European appearance commanded higher prices, a fact that directly influenced his selection of breeders. The logistics of the plan required precise timing. Clement calculated that with 5 women, his 3 daughters and 2 slaves, producing babies at staggered intervals, he could generate a constant flow of product for sale. He estimated each woman could produce a baby every 15 to 18 months, resulting in 2 to 3 annual sales. To maintain secrecy, Clement planned to conduct sales through intermediaries in distant markets. The babies would be transported to New Orleans or other cities by traders who didn't ask questions, ensuring no connection could be traced back to Delaney Plantation. He established contact with a man named Zach Thibodeau, a trader known for transporting slave babies and children without inquiring about their origin. Clement also prepared explanations for curious neighbors about any unusual activity. He planned to claim he was experimenting with modern slave breeding methods to improve productivity, an explanation that would be accepted without question in a society that viewed slaves as property. Clement's psychological preparation to implement his plan revealed the depth of his moral degradation. He began seeing his own daughters not as human beings with rights and dignity, but as resources to be exploited for his financial survival. This dehumanization was essential for him to proceed with actions any normal father would consider unthinkable. In August of 1860, Clement began testing his daughter's obedience with increasingly strange and invasive demands. He demanded they report intimate details about their feminine health, claiming paternal concern. When they hesitated or questioned these demands, he responded with anger and threats of punishment. The atmosphere in the big house grew increasingly oppressive. The Delaney daughters began to feel they were being constantly watched, that every movement was monitored and evaluated. They couldn't articulate their concerns, but instinctively felt something terrible was approaching. Leah and the other slaves also felt the change in atmosphere. Clement began treating them with a disturbing familiarity, making comments about their bodies and reproductive capabilities that went beyond even the normal degrading standards of slavery. They whispered among themselves about the changes, but didn't dare express their concerns openly. Dr. McCormick, during a routine medical visit in August, noticed signs of stress in the Delaney daughters. They seemed paler and more nervous than normal, and Frida, the youngest, showed signs of weight loss, suggesting chronic anxiety. When he tried to question Clement about the girl's health, he was dismissed with vague responses about normal family tensions. By September of 1860, Clement finally decided all preparations were complete. He had established the necessary contacts, prepared the facilities, psychologically conditioned his victims, and created the justifications he would use. What would follow was one of the most systematic campaigns of abuse and exploitation ever perpetrated within the confines of a single family. Clement's plan was about to be implemented, transforming Delaney Plantation from a home into a factory of horror, where his own children and grandchildren would become commodities in his desperate scheme for financial survival. If you're gripped by this disturbing investigation, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single detail of a story that's about to get much darker. In October of 1860, Clement Delaney implemented the first phase of his monstrous plan. The transformation of Delaney Plantation into a breeding farm began with a meeting he conducted with his daughters, presented as a discussion about family responsibilities during difficult times. Arlene was the first to be informed about her role in her father's scheme. Clement called her to his office on a cold October morning and, with the coldness of a businessman discussing a contract, explained that she would be mated with Tobias to produce children that would help save the plantation. When Arlene reacted with horror and refusal, Clement locked her in her room, informing her she would remain there until she accepted her family responsibility. Arlene's resistance lasted 3 days. During this period, Clement allowed her only water and small portions of bread, while regularly visiting her room to repeat his demands. He alternated between threats of physical violence and emotional appeals about filial duty, gradually breaking her resistance through a combination of deprivation and psychological manipulation. During these visits, he showed Arlene the family's debt documents, explaining in detail how they would lose everything if she didn't cooperate. Caroline and Frida were informed about their roles in the following days. Caroline, always more emotionally fragile, collapsed immediately, crying uncontrollably and begging her father to reconsider. Frida, despite being the youngest, showed more resistance, declaring she would rather die than participate in her father's abominable scheme. Clement responded to his daughter's resistance with calculated cruelty. He informed them that if they refused to cooperate voluntarily, he would simply force them. He had locked all exits from the big house and posted Tobias and other loyal slaves as guards, ensuring there was no possibility of escape. The first breeding session occurred on a November night in 1860. Clement personally escorted Arlene to one of the specially prepared cabins where Tobias waited. The slave, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, had been threatened with torture and death if he didn't follow his owner's orders. Tobias would later describe that night as the moment his soul died, forced to participate in an act that violated all his protective instincts. Clement remained outside the cabin throughout the entire process, ensuring his instructions were followed. He had established a rigid schedule for these sessions based on his calculations about his daughter's reproductive cycles. The cold efficiency with which he organized these encounters revealed the complete dehumanization of his own daughters in his mind. Joanna, initially kept ignorant of the plan's details, began to suspect something terrible was happening when she noticed the deteriorated emotional state of her daughters. Arlene became withdrawn and silent. Caroline developed frequent panic attacks, and Frida alternated between impotent fury and deep despair. When Joanna tried to question Clement about their strange behavior, he brutally informed her about his plan. He explained that the girls were fulfilling their family duty and that any interference on her part would result in severe consequences for the entire family. Horrified, Joanna felt completely powerless to intervene. Clement had made it clear he wouldn't hesitate to sell all the slaves and abandon the family if she tried to sabotage his plans. Leah and the other enslaved women were also integrated into Clement's breeding scheme. They were subjected to the same degrading process, forced to mate with selected male slaves at times determined by Clement. The difference was that, being already slaves, their children would automatically be Clement's property without the need for document falsification. Clement kept meticulous records of all reproductive activities on his plantation. He noted mating dates, estimated menstrual cycles, and predicted birth dates in a book he kept locked in his office. These records revealed the full extent of his obsession with maximizing the productivity of his scheme. In December of 1860, Arlene confirmed her first pregnancy. Clement received the news with cold satisfaction, immediately calculating the predicted birth date and the child's potential market value. He began making preparations for falsifying the birth documents, contacting Bogard in New Orleans to provide the necessary paperwork. Caroline became pregnant in January of 1861, followed by Leah in February. Clement was euphoric about the initial success of his plan, seeing it as confirmation that his strategy would work. He began making plans to expand the scheme, considering the possibility of acquiring more female slaves when his finances improved. Frida resisted longer, but finally became pregnant in March of 1861. Her pregnancy was particularly traumatic due to her young age and fragile physical constitution. Clement showed little concern for her well-being, focusing only on the potential value of her future child. During Frida's pregnancy, he often forced her to perform specific exercises he believed would improve the baby's quality. The atmosphere at Delaney Plantation became increasingly oppressive as the pregnancies progressed. The Delaney daughters were kept virtually prisoners in the big house, allowed out only under strict supervision. Clement claimed these restrictions were to protect their valuable cargo, but in reality, they were to prevent any escape attempts or pleas for help. Dr. McCormick was called to examine the pregnant women, but Clement carefully controlled these visits. The doctor was informed that the pregnancies were the result of consensual relationships between the Delaney daughters and slaves, an explanation that, while scandalous by the standards of the time, wasn't technically illegal. To ensure McCormick's silence, Clement offered the doctor a substantial sum, $50 per visit, well above normal rates. McCormick, facing his own financial difficulties, accepted the arrangement and agreed to maintain absolute discretion. Though disturbed by Clement's explanation, the extra money was too tempting to refuse. He noted, however, that the pregnant women seemed exceptionally stressed and traumatized, showing signs of severe depression that went far beyond what would be expected, even in unplanned pregnancies. Sheriff Mullins occasionally patrolled the area around the plantation, but Clement carefully avoided any suspicious activity during these visits. He had instructed everyone on the plantation to maintain normal appearances and not reveal anything about the breeding scheme to external visitors. As the pregnancies advanced, Clement began making preparations for the births. He acquired additional medical supplies and studied manuals on childbirth, determined to conduct the births without external medical assistance whenever possible. This would reduce the risk of exposing his scheme and eliminate potential witnesses. Clement also began establishing contacts with potential buyers for the babies. He made several trips to New Orleans, presenting himself as a slave breeder specializing in high-quality product. His contacts in the slave market were impressed with his descriptions of the future babies, especially those that would be of mixed ancestry. The first child was born in June of 1861, Arlene's son. The birth was difficult and traumatic, conducted by Clement with minimal assistance from Leah. Arlene suffered complications that nearly resulted in her death, but Clement was more concerned with the baby's health than the mother's. Immediately after birth, Clement separated the baby from Arlene, taking him to the slave quarters where he would be raised by a slave who had recently lost her own child. Arlene was informed she would never see the child again and that any attempt at contact would result in severe punishment. The falsified documents for the baby arrived from New Orleans a week after the birth. The birth certificate listed Leah as the mother, ensuring the child could be legally sold as a slave. Clement was satisfied with the quality of the forgery, which he believed would withstand any scrutiny from potential buyers. Just 3 weeks after the birth, Clement sold the baby to a slave trader in New Orleans for $250. The transaction was conducted through intermediaries, ensuring no connection could be traced back to Delaney Plantation. Clement used the money to pay some of his most urgent debts, seeing this as the ultimate validation of his plan. The success of the first sale encouraged Clement to accelerate the timeline for the next pregnancies. However, he decided to wait at least 6 months before forcing Arlene to participate in new breeding sessions, recognizing she needed time to physically recover from the traumatic birth. The second baby was born in August of 1861, Caroline's son. The birth was even more traumatic than the first, with Caroline suffering severe hemorrhaging that left her unconscious for 2 days. Clement, concerned only with the baby's survival, showed irritation with his daughter's medical complications, seeing them as unnecessary obstacles to his operation. Caroline never fully recovered from the physical and emotional trauma of that childbirth. She developed a condition we would recognize today as severe postpartum depression, but which Clement simply saw as feminine weakness. When she refused to eat or care for herself, he forced her to consume a mixture of herbs he claimed would restore her strength, but which actually contained substances intended to regulate her reproductive cycle. Caroline's baby was sold in September of 1861 for $275, a slightly higher price due to his particularly European appearance. Clement was satisfied with the growing profit and began making plans to expand his operation even further, considering the possibility of acquiring additional female slaves specifically for breeding. Frida gave birth in October of 1861, but her delivery was complicated by her young age and fragile constitution. The child was born premature and weak, requiring special care that Clement saw as an investment in its future market value. Frida suffered permanent physical damage during the childbirth, including internal injuries that would affect her ability to have children in the future. Dr. McCormick, called to assist with the birth due to the complications, expressed concern about Frida's health, but was silenced by another generous payment from Clement. The separation from her baby was particularly devastating for Frida. Unlike her older sisters, who had been gradually broken by the process, Frida maintained a spark of resistance that made losing her child even more traumatic. She begged her father to allow her to keep the child, offering to work as a slave in exchange for staying with her baby. Clement rejected Frida's pleas with utter coldness, informing her that maternal feelings were luxuries the family could not afford. He sold Frida's baby in November of 1861 for $225, a lower price due to the child's fragile health, but still a substantial profit in his distorted perspective. Leah also gave birth during this period, producing a baby that Clement sold without ceremony. As a slave, Leah had no legal rights over her child, but this didn't diminish her emotional suffering. Clement forced her to continue working in the big house just days after giving birth, showing total disregard for her physical recovery. Joanna, witnessing the horror unfolding in her own home, began developing signs of a mental collapse. She had repeatedly tried to intervene on behalf of her daughters, but Clement's threats of physical violence kept her in line. She began drinking secretly, using alcohol to numb the pain of seeing her daughters systematically destroyed. During the nights, she was often found wandering the house like a ghost, whispering desperate prayers and asking God's forgiveness for her inability to protect her daughters. The mental health of all the women on the plantation deteriorated rapidly under Clement's brutal regime. Arlene developed a catatonic condition, often remaining motionless for hours, staring into nothingness. Caroline suffered from constant nightmares and panic attacks that left her unable to function normally. Frida, the youngest, showed the most severe signs of psychological trauma. She began having hallucinations, often talking to her absent baby as if he were still present. Clement saw these symptoms as mere inconveniences that interfered with her reproductive capacity, not as signs of human suffering requiring compassion. In December of 1861, after allowing his daughters a few months to recover, Clement forced Arlene to participate in new breeding sessions. She became pregnant again in January of 1862, but her second pregnancy was marked by severe complications that threatened both her life and the baby's. Caroline also became pregnant again in March of 1862, but her deteriorated physical condition made the pregnancy extremely dangerous. Dr. McCormick, called to examine the women, expressed concern about their ability to survive additional births. But Clement dismissed these concerns as overly cautious, offering the doctor an additional bonus to keep his opinions to himself. Frida, still recovering from her first traumatic birth, was forced back into the breeding scheme in April of 1862. Her second pregnancy was even more difficult than the first, with complications developing from the early stages. Clement showed only irritation with these difficulties, seeing them as obstacles to his operation's efficiency. The atmosphere at Delaney Plantation grew increasingly dark as the winter of 1862 approached. The women lived in constant terror, never knowing when they would be forced into new breeding sessions or when their babies would be torn from their arms. Clement, in turn, became increasingly obsessive and paranoid. He saw conspiracy in any questioning of his actions and responded to challenges with growing violence. His transformation from family man to monster was complete. He seemed incapable of recognizing the humanity of his own daughters. The slaves on the plantation also suffered profoundly under Clement's brutal regime. Tobias and the other men forced to participate in the breeding scheme showed signs of deep psychological trauma, knowing they were unwilling accomplices in the destruction of their owners' daughters. In September of 1862, Arlene gave birth to her second child, but the baby was stillborn due to complications from her difficult pregnancy. Clement was furious about this investment loss, and blamed Arlene for not properly caring for her health. The baby's death was a devastating blow to Arlene, who had secretly hoped she might be able to keep this child. Caroline gave birth in October of 1862, but suffered severe complications that nearly resulted in her death. Dr. McCormick worked desperately to save her life, but it became clear she could not survive another pregnancy. Clement, irritated by the reduced productivity, began considering Caroline a depreciated asset. Frida gave birth in November of 1862, but the delivery was so traumatic she nearly died in the process. The baby survived, but Frida was permanently damaged, unable to walk without assistance and suffering constant pain. Clement sold the baby immediately, showing total disregard for his youngest daughter's critical condition. In January of 1863, the tragedy that had been building for years finally reached its climax. Frida, unable to endure more suffering and facing the prospect of being forced to become pregnant again despite her ruined physical condition, made a desperate decision that would shock even Clement and force Joanna to confront the full reality of what her husband had become. The discovery of Frida's body on a cold January morning would mark the beginning of the end for Clement Delaney's reign of terror, but would also reveal how deep the corruption had penetrated the soul of a man once considered a respectable member of Southern society. The morning of January 15, 1863, brought a discovery that would shake the very foundations of Delaney Plantation. Leah found Frida's body hanging from an improvised rope made of torn sheets in the attic of the big house. The young woman, only 17 years old, had chosen death as her only escape from the hell her life had become. Clement received the news of Frida's death with a coldness that shocked even Joanna. His first concern was not the loss of his youngest daughter, but the impact her death would have on his reproductive operation. He quickly calculated that he had lost a valuable productive unit, and began considering ways to compensate for this loss. Joanna, on the other hand, was utterly devastated by Frida's death. The sight of her youngest daughter's body hanging in the attic broke something fundamental in her psyche. She realized she had completely failed to protect her daughters and that her passivity had contributed to the tragedy that had unfolded in her own home. That night, she remained kneeling beside Frida's body for hours, whispering apologies and promises of revenge. Frida's funeral was a somber and hurried event. Clement insisted on a simple burial in the plantation cemetery, claiming he didn't want to attract unnecessary attention to the family. In reality, he feared a public funeral might lead to uncomfortable questions about the circumstances of Frida's death. Dr. McCormick was called to examine the body and issue a death certificate. He noticed signs of physical trauma on Frida that went beyond what would be expected from suicide, but Clement explained these marks as results of accidents during plantation work. McCormick was suspicious, but the money Clement had paid him over the years created a silent complicity that prevented him from asking deeper questions. Sheriff Mullins also investigated Frida's death, but his investigation was superficial. The society of the time rarely questioned deaths that occurred within private properties, especially when they involved family matters. Mullins accepted Clement's explanation of feminine melancholy as the cause of suicide. Frida's death marked a turning point for Joanna. She began secretly observing her husband's activities, mentally documenting the horrors he perpetrated against her surviving daughters. She realized she needed to act, but also knew that confronting Clement directly would be useless and dangerous. Joanna began establishing discreet contacts with some of the plantation's most trusted slaves, particularly those who had been forced to participate in Clement's breeding scheme. She discovered they were also deeply traumatized by their involuntary participation and yearned for a way to resist. Tobias, in particular, had been profoundly affected by his forced role in the abuse of the Delaney daughters. He had developed a protective loyalty toward the women and was willing to risk his life to help them. Joanna realized he could be a valuable ally in any plan to stop Clement. During whispered conversations in the slave quarters, Tobias revealed to Joanna that other slaves were also willing to act, united by the shared horror of what they had been forced to witness and participate in. In February of 1863, Arlene was forced to participate in new breeding sessions, despite still emotionally recovering from the loss of her second baby. Clement showed total disregard for her grief, seeing only the need to keep his operation running. Arlene became pregnant for a third time, but this pregnancy was marked by even more severe complications. Caroline, physically unable to endure another pregnancy due to the damage suffered in previous births, was spared from further breeding sessions, but Clement forced her to assume the role of supervisor for the other pregnant women. This function traumatized her further, forcing her to be complicit in the abuse against her own sister. Joanna, observing the systematic destruction of her remaining daughters, began formulating a desperate plan. She realized the legal authorities offered no protection against the horrors Clement perpetrated and that she would need to take extreme measures to save them. In April of 1863, Joanna began secretly meeting with Tobias and other loyal slaves during Clement's absences. They discussed in whispers the possibility of direct action against the plantation owner. Tobias revealed there were other slaves willing to participate, men who had been forced to commit acts that violated their conscience and who yearned for a chance at redemption. Clement began noticing subtle changes in the plantation's atmosphere. By May of 1863, the slaves seemed more united, whispering among themselves and interrupting conversations when he approached. His growing paranoia led him to implement stricter security measures, but this only served to increase the tension and resentment. As Arlene's third pregnancy progressed, it became clear she would not survive another birth. Dr. McCormick, called to examine her, expressed serious concern about her condition. But Clement dismissed these concerns, focusing only on the potential value of the baby she carried. In June of 1863, Joanna made a decision that would change everything. During one of Clement's nightly absences for card games, she met with Tobias and 3 other slaves in the slave quarters. They agreed that the only way to stop the horror was to eliminate Clement permanently. The plan they formulated was simple but effective. Clement had a habit of returning from his gambling sessions late at night, often drunk and vulnerable. They would wait for him on the trail leading back to the plantation, ambushing him when he was most defenseless. The perfect opportunity arose on a stormy night in July of 1863. Clement had made one of his regular trips to a local tavern to play cards, an activity he maintained despite the growing instability of the civil war in the region. Joanna knew he would return late, probably drunk and inattentive. Joanna and Tobias waited on the trail leading back to the plantation, hidden among the trees lining the path. 2 other slaves positioned themselves further ahead, ensuring Clement couldn't escape if he tried to flee. When Clement appeared, staggering on his horse due to alcohol, they ambushed him with an efficiency that suggested careful planning. Clement's death was quick, but not merciful. Tobias knocked him from his horse while Joanna held the animal's reins. They then carefully staged the scene to look like a robbery, scattering Clement's belongings and wounding the horse to suggest bandits had attacked a lone traveler. The growing lawlessness in the region during the Civil War made such an explanation perfectly plausible. Clement's body was discovered the next morning by a neighboring farmer passing through the trail. Sheriff Mullins investigated the scene and concluded Clement had been a victim of bandits, an explanation he accepted without question due to the increased violent crime in the area during the conflict. Joanna perfectly played the role of the grieving widow, expressing appropriate shock and sadness at her husband's death. No one suspected her involvement in the murder, and she was seen as just another victim of the tragic circumstances that had befallen her family. During the funeral, she cried genuine tears, not of sadness for Clement's death, but of relief that her daughters were finally free. With Clement's death, the reign of terror at Delaney Plantation came to an end. Joanna immediately freed all the slaves and began the process of selling the property, using the resources to care for her traumatized daughters and try to rebuild their lives. Arlene gave birth to her 3rd child in August of 1863, but the delivery nearly killed her. With Clement dead, Joanna could finally allow Arlene to keep her baby, a moment of bitter joy after years of horror. However, the physical and psychological damage Arlene had suffered was irreversible. Caroline never fully recovered from the traumas she had suffered, developing a nervous condition that left her unable to function normally for the rest of her life. She spent entire days in silence, occasionally having episodes where she relived the horrors she had experienced. Arlene, though she physically survived, carried deep emotional scars that never completely healed. She developed a profound aversion to physical contact and never managed to form normal relationships with men. The baby she was allowed to keep became her only source of joy in a life marked by tragedy. Joanna dedicated the rest of her life to caring for her traumatized daughters, always carrying the guilt for not acting sooner to protect them. She often wondered if she could have saved Frida if she had found the courage to act earlier, a question that would torment her until her dying day. The truth about what happened at Delaney Plantation died with Clement and was buried with the secrets of those who survived. Tobias disappeared after liberation, probably moving north where he could live as a free man. Before leaving, he visited Joanna one last time, expressing gratitude that she had found the courage to act when official justice had failed. Leah also left after liberation, taking with her the traumatic memories of her forced participation in Clement's scheme. She settled in New Orleans, where she worked as a seamstress and never spoke about her years at Delaney Plantation. Until her death decades later, she carried the physical and emotional scars of her experience. Dr. McCormick continued practicing medicine in the region, but never again accepted questionable payments for his silence. Frida's death and the subsequent discovery of the horrors at the plantation haunted him for the rest of his career, serving as a constant reminder of the consequences of his silent complicity. Sheriff Mullins remained ignorant of the truth about Clement's death until his own death years later. His superficial investigation and easy acceptance of the robbery explanation reflected the limitations and prejudices of a legal system that protected men like Clement while failing utterly to protect their victims. The story of Delaney Plantation remains a dark reminder of how desperation and greed can completely corrupt the human soul. Clement Delaney transformed his own family into merchandise, proving that the horrors of slavery could extend far beyond traditional racial lines. What makes this story particularly disturbing are not just the individual acts of cruelty, but the systematic dehumanization that Clement implemented. He didn't act on impulse or passion, but with the calculating coldness of a businessman optimizing a commercial operation. His own daughters became productive units in a mental spreadsheet of profits and losses. The Southern Society of 1860, with its legal structures that protected absolute patriarchal authority, created the perfect environment for such horrors to flourish in secret. The laws governing slavery, originally intended to maintain control over enslaved African populations, were perverted by Clement to enslave his own descendants. Dr. McCormick and Sheriff Mullins, representatives of the established social order, completely failed to recognize or intervene in the horrors unfolding right before their eyes. Their superficial investigations and acceptance of convenient explanations reveal how the society of the time was structured to protect men like Clement, not their victims. Joanna's final resistance represents both redemption and tragedy. Her decision to orchestrate her husband's death came too late to save Frida and prevent years of trauma for her other daughters. However, her action demonstrates that even in the most desperate circumstances, the human conscience can eventually rebel against absolute evil. Tobias and the other slaves who participated in the revenge against Clement show how oppression can create unexpected alliances. United by shared suffering, they transcended the racial barriers imposed by society to seek justice when the legal system failed. The fate of Clement's surviving daughters illustrates how trauma can leave permanent scars that no amount of subsequent care can completely heal. Arlene and Carolyn carried the physical and psychological marks of their experience for the rest of their lives, living reminders of the horrors they had endured. The ease with which Clement managed to falsify documents and sell babies reveals the fundamentally corrupt nature of the slavery system. A market that treated human beings as property inevitably created opportunities for even more extreme abuses, where even the most sacred family bonds could be moneyized. Perhaps the most shocking aspect of this story is how Clement managed to rationalize his actions. In his distorted mind, he wasn't abusing his daughters, he was saving the family through necessary sacrifices. This capacity for self-justification shows how apparently normal people can become monsters when circumstances and incentives align perversely. Delaney Plantation was eventually sold and divided into smaller parcels. The big house was demolished in the 1870s, and today nothing remains to mark the place where so many horrors were perpetrated. The land that once witnessed such cruelty now sustains peaceful crops, as if nature itself were trying to erase the memories of what happened there. The official records of the time list Clement Delaney simply as killed by bandits, and Frida as a victim of melancholy. These sanitized descriptions hide the brutal truth of their deaths and perpetuate the invisibility of the victims of domestic abuse and sexual exploitation. This story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth: monsters are rarely strangers hiding in the shadows. More often, they are fathers, husbands, and authority figures who use their position of trust to perpetrate the worst types of abuse. Social respectability can be a perfect mask for the deepest depravity. Joanna's final courage, though it came too late to prevent complete tragedy, offers a lesson about the importance of acting against injustice, even when the personal cost is high. Her decision to orchestrate Clement's death was morally complex, an act of vigilante justice born from the complete failure of the legal system to protect the innocent. Today, when we hear about cases of domestic abuse or sexual exploitation, we must remember that victims often face the same obstacles as the Delaney daughters: authorities who don't believe them, legal systems that protect perpetrators, and societies that prefer to ignore inconvenient truths. The story of Delaney Plantation remains a dark testimony to the human capacity for both absolute evil and heroic resistance. It reminds us that eternal vigilance is the price of protecting the vulnerable, and that sometimes, justice can only be achieved through means that society itself considers illegal. On silent nights in the Mississippi Delta, when the wind blows through the fields where Delaney Plantation once existed, some say you can still hear echoes of the past, not supernatural ghosts, but the persistent memories of injustices that were never adequately recognized or repaired. This is a story that forces us to look into the darkest corners of human nature, but it also reminds us that even in the most desperate circumstances, there always exists the possibility of resistance, redemption, and eventually, justice. Even if it comes by the hands of those society least expects to deliver it. If this dark investigation has captivated you, make sure to subscribe to The Truth Fear and hit that notification bell. We dive deep into the shadows of history to uncover stories that mainstream sources won't touch. Tales of human depravity, supernatural encounters, and mysteries that continue to haunt us to this day.